Thank you for coming, and thank you for honoring us, with your participation to presence. We are very honored and very happy to have him with us. It turned out to be a fortuitous time because he has a holiday in Kuwait, right? Some of you may know that he is the president of the American University of Kuwait, so yes. So let me give you a very little background for those of you that don't know him. Dr. Tim Sullivan served as a professor of political science here at AUC since 1973. He received his BA in political science from Seattle University and his PhD in international relations and government from the Claremont Graduate University. He had several academic experiences. He taught at the University of Portland, the University of California, Los Angeles, and the University of Utah. He served as provost of AUC from 1998 to 2008, that's 10 years, and was founding faculty advisor for Cairo International Model United Nations. Simon, is it called? Simon, right? Simon and Cairo International Model Arab League, SIMAL. He retired from AUC in 2009 as provost emeritus after spending the 2008 and 2009 academic year on his final sabbatical. He served as the interim president of the American University of Kuwait in 2010, and in October 2016, AUK's Board of Trustees voted unanimously to appoint him 5th president of AUK effective January 27th and 2017. So that's 7 years after the interim presidency. And during all that time, I kept hearing, I wish he was there. For anybody I met from the Kuwait University, they said, I wish Tim would come as our president. So he finally succumbed. Okay, well, Tim's talk today is about invigorating the uninitiated, the unmotivated, is that it? Energizing, yeah, the unmotivated. And it's a topic that is coming up again and again and again, more and ever. Thank you, Tim, and I'm sure everybody's waiting patiently for you to talk.
Thank you very much. Everybody needs a crutch in life, and today my crutch is this. I had actually requested a slightly smaller crutch, but it'll have to do. I actually have a rather bad back, if you wonder why, and I have a rather bad back, and I must say, I love this room, I love this campus, I don't love these chairs. First I want to thank Dr. Alozi and the wonderful staff of the center for inviting me. When we created this a few years ago, I saw my role as that of providing the center with what it needed, supporting its efforts, and then getting out of the way, so Aziza and her staff could inject even more creative pedagogy into AUC's already energized pedagogical DNA. They succeeded to an amazing degree, and the conference is a demonstration of that success. The invitation to join the festivities today provided me with an irresistible opportunity that I maybe should have resisted. And that was to reflect on how university-level teaching has changed over the course of my life. Fortunately, or perhaps unfortunately, that reflection led me inexorably to the sometimes depressing topic I decided to discuss. If there's a handbook on how to give a keynote address, it probably says something like this. Speakers should select a topic that says something that they know a great deal about, give an uplifting address that inspires the audience to go forth and do great and wonderful things. I guess I didn't read it, because rather than follow that kind of advice, I decided to talk about something that really bothers me, to present you with a problem, and I don't really have, I can't say I've fixed it. It literally keeps me awake at night. It's how to motivate the unmotivated. And by unmotivated, I'm not talking about the kind of ordinary, they need a kick in the pants people. I'm talking about people where the motivation issue is much more serious. I don't claim to be an expert on it. I can't have any real special knowledge. It's something I've been worrying about for about 2 decades. It started with a couple of trips in the region, one to Morocco, another to the Emirates, and it got me worrying about this issue because I kept hearing about it, and I keep hearing about it, it keeps coming back. So instead of coming to you with a solution, I'm coming to you with a predicament, and I hope you and your colleagues can solve, Aziza. When I was an undergraduate, I started reflecting, few, if any, colleges or universities had anything even remotely like the Center for Learning and Teaching at AUC. I believe the first such organization was established actually at the University of Michigan in 1962. You're probably more expert than I, you may know more. But at that time, classes were based on lectures, seminars, laboratories, independent study. That was it. Public institutions, introductory level classes were almost all organized around lectures to large classes in which there was little, if any, opportunity for anyone to ask a question, particularly of the professor. Discussion sessions might be held, but there were graduate students or others assisting. Teaching assistants helped in labs, discussions, etc. In many institutions at the time that I know of, grading was very deliberately at the freshman level on a curve, and they deliberately flunked out, say, 10% of every entering class. Accommodations for students with learning disabilities of any kind, virtually unknown. I attended a small private university. It was quite different from the large public institutions at the time. Largest class I took had about 50 students on the 4 years I was there. Another thing that's different, it took me 4 years. These days, at least in the US, the average is 6+ years to finish. Largest class was 50, and even in that class, there was opportunity for discussion, what they called dialogue with the professor. But the range of options for the type of instruction was about the same things, except in this case, it was dialogue with the professor. Classes were smaller. There were no mass lectures of any kind. Faculty held office hours, and lots of them. And many professors clearly cared about the students and mentored us as well as taught us and well as advised us. Grading was on an absolute scale, never on a curve. A common complaint then, common complaint now, common complaint here, probably wherever any of you are, is students are not prepared for my class. And that usually meant something to do with language or math or both. That was certainly true then. And the question is, what happened to them? And the issue is they failed. If they had weak skills, there were very little accommodations, and simply they failed. In the years since then, a lot has changed. Not everything. Lectures, seminars, labs, independent studies still predominate at most universities. I've spent a fair amount of my life going to universities on what they call a busman's holiday. You go on a trip, where do you go? To a university. Go on another trip, where do you go? To a university. So you see what's going on in other places and over this period in other times. Students with learning disabilities may fare better in some places than others and receive varying degrees of accommodation. Very sketchy. Counseling centers exist in some universities that didn't exist then. A big change is many places are trying to pay more attention to pedagogy at the university level, because historically, almost no attention has been paid to pedagogy at the university level. If you think about it, in many countries around the world, no matter how poor, no matter how difficult things are, teachers in elementary or high schools, that level, receive some form of teacher training. They're not only taught about the subject matter, about what to teach, but they're taught about how to teach. Might be good, might be not so good, but somebody makes an effort. Since the foundation of the world's first universities, however, university professors have seldom, if ever, had any instruction on how to teach. Knowledge of the subject matter was paramount. That was considered, in fact, sufficient. That's all it took. For the most part, professors followed in the footsteps of their own professors, and if students were lucky, they did for the best of their professors. But it was really up to them. Many viewed their role as one of transferring knowledge. This is a lecture, I'm lecturing, your job is you get what I give you. That's your job, I'll do mine, you do yours, you prove you got what I gave you, and then we'll all let you go on to the next class. Successful students took notes, they proved it. If they didn't get it, they failed. End of story. Today, in many places, like this one, and many of the places that all of you come from, the focus has changed. You might call it the new pedagogy. Changed from teaching to learning. When we started this, they changed the name. It was going to be a teaching center. No, we're going to be learning and teaching, to put learning first. Symbolically, I think that worked, and pedagogically, it's working here. Many professors today claim to be guides on the side instead of sages on the stage. Smart technology is embedded in college pedagogy around the world in some places. I did one of my, as Aziza pointed out, I retired, then I unretired, and I've unretired a few other times, and one of the unretired was a brief consultancy in Afghanistan. Technology has reached there. They have bombs, they have guns, they have technology, they have video conferencing, they have computers, they have PowerPoint, they have, you name it, they've got it there and elsewhere. Smart technology is embedded in teaching at many universities, not all, some. It's as if it was the 10th century. Chat rooms online have replaced office hours. Students take exams, submit papers by email. Classrooms have been flipped, and success in higher education is supposed to be measured by outcomes, what students learn, not on inputs such as lectures. Now, as important as many innovations may be, it's not clear to me that they are adequate to address the issue that I'm going to throw on you. Simply put, I'm not sure that they will enable us to reach the students who are not doing well because they are so seriously unmotivated, they have lost hope. Nothing inspires them. When I was teaching, I had students who had motivation issues, but all they needed was a nudge, a little twist, to get them to do more. I seldom had to deal with seriously unmotivated students. None of them had lost hope. So I can't claim to be a great expert on this. In previous generations, people who lacked motivation may not have attended a university. If they weren't motivated, why would they go to a university? And faculty may not have had to deal with them very much, and if they did, they probably failed out in the first year, and nobody ever asked why. They just assumed they weren't ready, or not smart enough, or whatever it was, but they didn't worry about them. Somebody did, but the university probably didn't. That's no longer true, and it can be a problem in some countries and an entire region. I'm currently based in Kuwait, as Aziza said, and that is the Gulf, not specifically. One of the places I learned that motivation is a particular problem throughout this region, and interestingly enough, it's a problem in the richest part of the area. One reason for lack of motivation may be what has been called the hope deficit. 1962, I was at a conference in Marrakesh, and there were several keynote speakers, just like this one, although I think they had maybe 5 or 6. They outdid you in that, Aziza. I'm not too sure anybody remembered what any of the keynote speakers said except one. Queen Rania of Jordan gave a talk about the hope deficit, and she really got people's attention. There were educators from all over the Arab world there at a conference on how to change university education to produce students who would be productively employed in the private sector. And the emphasis was on productive employment. Rania talked about the hope deficit. Her theme was that there was a burgeoning crisis at that time, hope, H-O-P-E. A crisis brought about because large numbers of young Arabs had a vision of the future of their country and their region that was bleak, to say the least. They looked at the future and they saw nothing to be hopeful about. They feared that even if they did well in schools and universities, it would not matter. It just wouldn't matter, because the external circumstances were such that their individual efforts would never be rewarded or recognized. Jobs were scarce. Getting a degree did not necessarily mean it would lead to a better life. They would find, in many cases, they had a university degree, but few, if any, marketable skills. They didn't have whatever it was the market was looking for. The implication of this for pedagogy is different. At that time, there was a political implication of this. If they have lost hope, they may turn to violence, they may turn to revolution, they may turn to immigration, they may turn to drugs, to crime. But our issue is we can't fix any of those things. Our problem is they're in our classrooms. They're in your classrooms, they're in our classrooms, they're there. And a brilliant lecture, a flipped classroom, or a sexy PowerPoint presentation is probably not going to really be adequate to give them reason to hope for the future, because that's what they need. The hope deficit may have particular resonance in countries like Egypt or Jordan or Tunisia, places where I've seen it and visited, and certainly here. But you'd think students in the Gulf wouldn't have a problem. They would see a bright future for themselves and their countries. And the interesting thing is they do. A recent survey done of Arab youth showed that by far the young people in the Gulf countries are by far the most optimistic about their own country and their own futures of all the students in the Arab world. It's a broad survey. It did, I think, 12 different countries that were surveyed, and in large size samples, so it's pretty reliable. Paradoxically, the same people experience higher levels of depression and anxiety than they do in other places. How do you motivate students who are optimistic, depressed, and anxious? Now, I hope we can collectively come up with some creative ideas of how organizations like this one can help faculty who are looking for guidance on how to teach poorly motivated students. There are some generic ideas that are brought about. You've dealt with some of them, I think, in some of the conferences today. I know Aziza was over at a table here talking about, among other things, motivation. What I'm talking about, though, is probably more severe than we normally deal with. Certainly more severe than I dealt with in universities and in the classroom for a total of 31 years. This is different. And I think the problem is it may not be recognized as being actually different. Specialists that in training to do something works better and lasts longer than extrinsic. And that because how did most of us get wherever it is what path we took to get here through life? Probably because, among other things, we were intrinsically motivated to do something. We found whatever our subject was intrinsically interesting. Nobody had to kick us to study too hard anyway. They found some parents, for example, get an A and I'll give you $10 or 100 pounds, or in Kuwait, a Lexus. I'm not making that example up, by the way. The problem is paying people, giving them a reward for doing it like that, is an extrinsic motivator. It lasts only so long as you keep paying. And eventually, you're going to run out even of Lexuses. There aren't enough. But if we can turn that around and get people interested in the subject, if we can turn it around and do other things, we can induce them to study and work and change for the rest of their lives. How can we do this? Pause for a minute. If they're so unmotivated, why are they in a university in the first place? Why did they come? Well, put your shoes, 17 years. And one of the things you tend to do in this part of the world, more than perhaps some others that I can think of, is you do what Daddy says to do. Okay? And Daddy says, you're going to the university. Oh, harder. You do it, right? Daddy may also say, the world needs engineers. You are going to be an engineer. Harder. You can't add, but you're going to be an engineer, right? So one of the issues is parental influence. They're there because that's the family expectation. Another is simply they don't know what else to do. They're 17 or 18. There are no jobs for a school leaver at that age. And besides, the only marketable skill they have is perhaps for the males to do manual labor. And they're not quite up for that in many ways. And besides, there's a lot of competition for manual labor. You can see around here, for those of you who are visitors, if you drive around this area, you'll see sometimes a bunch of men standing on a corner. They're waiting to be hired. It's an impromptu labor market. That's what they're doing there. They don't want some 17-year-old kid showing up, competing. They have 12 people to feed. And if they don't get a job, those 12 people are hungry. For a variety of reasons, then, people go to a university, in a sense, to stave off the inevitable. In some cases, young women are staving off marriage as long as they can. Some institutions might deal with this by creating external motivators. They require students to attend class, they do other things, hoping they will develop the intrinsic motivation to learn. I like to think of it, they may not have read Shakespeare's Henry IV, but they might think, my students are really like Prince Hal. If you remember the play, Prince Hal was goofing off with Falstaff all the time, having a riotous time, doing horrible things he shouldn't have done. But eventually he figured out his job was to be king. And he started and changed and gradually, intrinsically drove himself to change. Instead of picking up yet another flagon of ale or yet another glass of wine, he eventually picked up a sword and became king. It's a coming-of-age story, among other things. We expect our students to do that, and maybe we keep them long enough to get them started. And they are spontaneously become like Prince Hal. But as teachers, I don't think we can count on that. We need to work with the students we have in our classes, not as we wish they would be, and try to prod the unmotivated as best as we can. We have to figure out how to get them to do this. There are some things that have been suggested, and Many of you had talked about these kinds of things in workshops and discussions, and there have been presentations about it, about how to get them engaged. We talk about active teaching methods. We talk about using examples that students can relate to, so they see the point. Many other things that have gone on throughout the conference. Now, one factor, in my view, that all of these methods, maybe at least some, maybe all, have in common, is they work best when professors are aware of the needs of their students as individuals, not just as an undifferentiated group, which, among other things, works best when the classes are small enough where that can happen. In this country, there are classes of 5,000 students in freshman classes at state universities, and that similar things happen elsewhere. I've talked to faculty at some public institutions who are delighted because they get to teach the seminar for the seniors. The seminar has 200 students. If we think about this, we have a group, two large groups though. One, they're suffering from the hope deficit and they're demotivated because the social, political, and economic problems of their countries are so intractable, the only future they envisage is harsh. By contrast, in the Gulf region, people are provided with so much that a life of relative ease and comfort is guaranteed with little or no effort. So why work? In another country, a friend of mine teaching there was told by a student who wouldn't work very hard that the reason he wouldn't work very hard, it was 19 years old and he had a red Ferrari. But there are other reasons. Just a couple of examples of the kind of demotivation I'm talking about, and these are real. The red Ferrari is real. In some institutions, again, most of these are drawn from public institutions, they discovered that they had a fairly large cohort of students who'd been at the university for 12 years, and they had not had enough credits to achieve junior status. Why? They register for 4, they drop all but 1, and they just keep going because they don't see the point. They really don't see a point. Another, in one instance at another institution, people were asked in a survey, what motivates you? The most common response in a class was nothing. Nothing. They did follow-ups. What motivates you? Nothing. Are you serious? Yes. Nothing. Hard to imagine for people like us. And that might make it harder for us to reach them. Many students say, no matter what I do, the result will be the same in the end. Now, I guess there are some things here that I'm trying to say, which is that it's not also a one-size-fits-all. The situation in one country will be different from that of another. That is, Afghanistan is not Egypt, or Utah, where I have a house, or Kuwait, or Tunis, or Zagazig. So what works in one place may not work in another. We know what works according to best practices. But best practices boil down to this group of students with this teacher in this class, in that time, in that place. And that's what we have to figure out how to make it work. Students in 2018 are not the same as the students of the late 20th century, let alone those when I was an undergraduate. Some methods of teaching have survived. Many have changed and transmogrified into flipped classrooms and other sorts of things that work. But even faculty who are particularly adept at mentoring won't be 100% successful. There may be no single solution to the conundrum of finding the most efficacious methods and pedagogy to deal with the large numbers of seriously unmotivated students who now are in universities in this part of the world and others. There's no magic formula, nothing that'll make it go away. There is no silver bullet, as Americans sometimes say. What there only is left with is patient attention to each seriously unmotivated student until they're energized. The challenge is Sisyphean, not romantic. It's a challenge of motivating one student at a time, going on to the next, and on into the future until the external circumstances that generated the lack of motivation in young people change for the better. We've talked about a flipped classroom. Let me flip a question. In the earlier era, what happened to students who were unmotivated or unprepared? They failed. I want you to just think of something. Unless the students are learning, are we really teaching? Did the students fail? Or did we fail them? Thank you for your patience. Questions, or are we headed for the bus? I was thinking of a keynote's address. Sometimes I'm sandwiched between lunch and a bus. There was an occasion where someone was giving a keynote address that started at 4:30, and at 5 o'clock they opened the bar. He was in real trouble. So thank you very much.
I think a person like me who is trying to help faculty like Aziz are not doing as great probably a job, but that is a food for thought. And it certainly realized that we've been talking about to go about our business of supporting faculty. We haven't talked about the largest stakeholder in the context, and that's the student. And we haven't talked about including the student into our process, I think, as successfully as we should be doing. And when you talk of hope deficit, we did an institutional survey the same way by CLT on what were the worst problems teachers faced in the classroom. And it was, again, teacher focused. And I think 85% of the faculty said lack of student motivation. That is no different to what you're saying happens in many other universities. But I now realize that we should have asked the question to the students also. What are the reasons for lack of motivation? And hope deficit, if I may comment, what you said is something that we haven't figured in developing countries as a part of a malaise. You are totally right, are developing, and that is the angle that we have not built into our planning at any level of the government, starting from the policymaker to education institutions. There is a different type of lack of motivation, like you alerted us to, and I think that needs some sort of concerted action on part of all of us to look at how to resolve it at our end. And I think that the other thing that I think I have felt in terms of teacher and student disconnect is the generation deficit. We are totally, I am a baby boomer. I could never understand the millennium of today that does different things and thinks about everything differently to the way I look at things. So I think that's another angle that we haven't plugged in. We haven't found an intermediate plug to connect generation gaps that are very, very real. I mean, So that is, so I think these are the points that I think you made me rethink how to look at them. Thank you so much. Very.
Thank you. Let's see, what do I do? Is this on? No. Yeah, the generation gap also, I have to say, exists in many countries, but it's particularly striking in this region and some others. The Gulf, even more than some other places, actually. Because if you think of the social changes that have occurred in Gulf countries, where literally, if I go back to not too long, in my sense of time, at least a couple decades only, and you think the ruler of the country started life as a camel herder, okay? And now he's one of the richest men in the world, okay? And he's governing a country. So the social changes that have occurred so rapidly that it's very hard for people to adjust to them. That's certainly true in Kuwait, where you have families that not too long ago were making their living fishing, pearling, or merchant trade. Completely different economy now. Completely different expectations, completely different things. So how do we reach them? Because they're not trying to reach us. Our job is to figure out how to do that. And finding those common denominators. We know they like phones, they like technology, they like other things, and that does help. But you have to have something, common language to talk about. How do you get people to read who at age 16 or 17 have never read a book? Literally, have never read a book. So what's the trigger? My wife had an idea, by the way, that instead of titling the lecture what I did, I should give it a different title. The First Salted Peanut. That is, what's that thing that's going to trigger them to say, I want more of that? And she's obviously smarter than I am. I should have probably given her that title. But I think it is hard. The generation gap makes it harder. You also have institutions where the faculty are maybe not the same nationality, religion, etc., as the students. So there are so many barriers to understanding or communication that we, the faculty, need to learn an awful lot more in order to be effective in a classroom. But if what I said is true, that if they aren't learning, the students aren't learning, then we aren't teaching, then the barriers are for us to overcome. And part of those barriers are cultural and psychological, and it's not going to be easy. We do know there's some evidence that one of the things that reaches people is simply the belief that their teachers care. It's not definitive. You can't say that's proven, etc. But there's at least some suggestion, and that's sort of the implication of what I'm arguing here. But I don't see any, there's no magic bullet, there is no key. Anything else? Yeah, back at.
Team, welcome back. I want actually to raise another aspect of the problem of motivation. I mean, we are talking here with a very broad brush. Depends very much on the disciplines, countries, ages, cultures, all of that. But I want to raise a dimension that seems to be completely overlooked. Over-motivated students. And you have that sometimes in some classes where some students take over the class. And you have that problem sometimes with some classes when your colleagues hate you because their students don't work as much. I want you to talk about your own experience concerning MUN and MAL. When students get too interested and neglect class. I have seen it in many other institutions.
Okay. It was mentioned that I don't, do we have time? Okay. That I was the founding faculty advisor for two large student organizations, the Cairo International Model United Nations and an Arab League version. They were, at that the two largest student organizations here, hundreds of students. And people did get involved, and they would be at my meetings rather than class and things of that nature, and people on the faculty and elsewhere did get irritated with me. And a president of the university at the time cussed me out in public for this because he thought Model United Nations was an utterly useless enterprise. He had spent his life at the United Nations, and Model weren't real at all. 2 years later, he claimed he invented it because it was so successful. His picture is on the wall in a building down the way. One of the things that I'd have to say that made that work was I looked at my job as empowering the students. They sometimes picked topics to discuss because it really wasn't a model. It was more model for than model of. And they would select the agenda. And some of the agenda items they picked weren't, well, at one conference, the press came and asked me what the agenda was, and I told them, and it got to the agenda of one thing that had to do with female genital mutilation and discrimination against people on the grounds of gender orientation. Students had picked these for a human rights discussion. And the interviewer reached over, grabbed the microphone, took it out of my hand and said, "You can't say that on Egyptian TV." And that night on Egyptian television, it was proudly announced that the students at the American University in Cairo had gathered together to condemn Israel. But what I did was defend their right to make that decision. And even if I didn't always agree, to defend it and keep it going from critics in the university and critics outside. But the thing that I think made it work the most was it wasn't graded. Everybody was a volunteer. And in that program, my students were my colleagues. They taught me. We taught each other. It worked. Tanya?
Poverty or some other sustainable development, they pick the area. And then there is a core of courses built around that area with interconnected, like climate change would have a bit of science. And so I think that was a very powerful way of motivating the student to be a master of his own choice, rather than us, though we in liberal arts education, we give a sprinkling, but like in countries like us, they have no clue what to take and why to take what they want to take. So they just pick up some to make the credits, you know, something from here, something from there. So making their choice easy is not a bad idea of giving them areas to work in, and then offer courses within that area, which are a sprinkling of all those. And I think that was a very clever way of devising education.
I think that's a very good idea, and it worked for lots of students. But for those for whom the answer to that question is what
Gets
you
them
know,
to the college,
what
yeah.
is, when the answer is nothing,
Nothing, yeah.
they
I
will
agree.
look at that menu
Yeah,
and they won't make a choice.
yeah, I agree. I agree.
And
There will
it's
be some-
that group
Yeah,
that we need to figure out how to
yeah,
reach.
that's true.
I think all of you know better than I do how to reach the students who would respond to that kind of a situation.
I'm sure.
It's what do you do with those who look at that list of choices and they just shrug their shoulders and walk away. I'm not trying to rain on your parade, but it's a real problem for hundreds of thousands of students.
True. Thank you.
Thank you very much.